I never meant to fall for her. Not the woman who spoke in silences, who smiled like she was hiding a lifetime behind her eyes. But the night she looked at me and said, "You have no idea how much I feel," something inside me finally understood what it means to be seen. It started with something simple. A cup of coffee. Her hair was tied loosely, a few strands falling forward when she worked the espresso machine. Her smile was polite, practiced, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that behind it was something she hadn't let anyone see for a long time. The first time she spoke to me, her voice caught me off guard. It wasn't just the tone, low, calm, with that quiet kind of strength. It was how she said my name when she read it off the cup, like she was tasting it, letting it linger a second too long before moving on. "Another refill?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "Yeah, please," I said, though I hadn't even finished half my cup. I just wanted her to stay a moment longer. Our hands brushed when she took the mug from me. A small thing, almost nothing, but in that brief touch, I felt something that didn't make sense. Not attraction, not yet. More like recognition. The kind you feel when someone mirrors a silence you've been carrying alone. Over the next few days, I kept finding reasons to return. Sometimes I told myself it was for the coffee, sometimes for the quiet corner seat by the window. But deep down, I knew it was for her, the woman who seemed both grounded and far away. There was a kind of poetry in how she existed. She didn't fill the room with her presence. She softened it. I caught her smiling at customers, laughing quietly with an older man who came in for his morning tea. But when she thought no one was watching, her face changed. Her smile faded into something gentler, sadder, more real. I remember one morning, lights spilling across the counter, dust dancing in the air. She looked up and met my eyes. For a moment, she didn't look away. Something unspoken passed between us, quiet but undeniable. That's when I realized this wasn't just another morning, and she wasn't just another stranger. She had a presence that made time hesitate. And somehow, I knew this woman, this quiet, self-contained stranger with a weary smile, was about to change something in me that I didn't even know needed changing. And all it began with was a simple cup of coffee. Days turned into weeks, and the café slowly became part of my routine. Though if I was honest, it wasn't the coffee I was coming for anymore. It was her, Elena, the woman who carried quiet like it was an art form. I never asked for her story outright, but I started to learn pieces of it in fragments. In the way she paused before answering simple questions, or how her eyes softened when she talked about books. There was a shelf behind the counter filled with old novels, their spines worn from years of use. Sometimes, when the cafe was empty, she'd pull one down, tracing her fingers along the pages before setting it aside again. I asked her once what her favorite was. She smiled, a small, knowing smile, and said, "The ones that don't rush to the ending." That answer stayed with me. Maybe it was about stories, or maybe it was about her eyes lifted toward me, calm but searching, as if waiting for something she couldn't name. We talked a little about music, old movies, things that didn't matter but somehow did. Every sentence felt suspended between us, every pause charged with quiet awareness. At one point, she looked out at the rain and said softly, "It's strange, isn't it? How some people find comfort in noise and others in silence." I smiled. I think silence says more than most people realize. She looked back at me then, really looked. And in that moment, something shifted. The air between us wasn't empty anymore. It was alive, fragile, tender, waiting. When I left that night, I walked slower than usual, as if trying to carry the weight of that silence with me. It wasn't heavy, just real. I realized that I didn't need to ask for her story. Somehow, I was already part of it. And for reasons I couldn't explain, sitting across from her, listening to the rain, watching her smile fade into thought, felt more intimate than anything I'd ever known. There are moments that slip past you without warning. Quiet, ordinary seconds that somehow become permanent. That's what it felt like the evening I saw her differently. Not as the woman behind the counter, not as the stranger I spoke to through small talk and silence, but as someone I suddenly needed to understand. It was late, the kind of late when the cafe lights dimmed just enough to blur the edges of everything. I'd stayed longer than usual, pretending to read, though my eyes kept drifting toward her. She was wiping down tables, humming softly under her breath, an old tune, almost haunting. Then she stopped, mid-melody. Her hand rested on the table, still. I followed her gaze and saw an envelope in her other hand. Aged, creased, the paper yellowed with time. She didn't open it. She just stared at it, the way you look at something that remembers a version of you that no longer exists. When she noticed me watching, she gave a faint smile, half apology, half deflection. "Old memories," she said, voice low. I didn't ask what kind. I just nodded. Some stories didn't need to be told to be understood. She sat across from me a few minutes later, the letter still on the table between us. For the first time, she looked tired, not physically, but in a way that came from carrying too much for too long. "You ever feel like you've lived too many lives in one lifetime?" she asked. I hesitated, then said, "Maybe not too many, just too heavy." She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that hides a sigh. That's one way to put it. The conversation drifted from there. She spoke about the places she'd been, how time had a way of erasing people's names, but never the way they made you feel. I listened, not because I had to, but because her voice made even the sad parts sound beautiful. There was a small pause after that. Not awkward, just delicate. She leaned back in her chair, looking at me with a kind of curious gentleness. "You're easy to talk to," she said. "Maybe because I don't expect answers," I replied. That made her smile. Not the polite smile I'd seen before, but something real, unguarded. And for a heartbeat, her eyes softened in a way that made the world feel smaller, quieter. When she finally stood to close the cafe, she brushed past me, and her hand briefly rested on my shoulder, light but intentional. A silent thank you. I walked home that night with the image of her smile etched in my mind. The way her eyes shimmered beneath the low light, how the sadness in them didn't make her weaker, but human. I didn't know what it was yet, attraction, empathy, or something deeper, but I knew this. Something inside her had shifted, and maybe quietly, something inside me had too. The days after that night felt different, quieter, heavier, as if something unspoken had started breathing between us. Elena and I still exchanged the same smiles, the same polite greetings, but something in her eyes had changed. There was warmth there, yes, but also hesitation. It began subtly. She stopped sitting across from me when the cafe was empty. She'd stay behind the counter longer, finding reasons to keep her hands busy, rearranging pastries, polishing cups that didn't need polishing. Every movement seemed meant to fill the silence that used to feel so comfortable between us. One evening, when I thanked her for the tea she'd brought me, she only nodded, her smile faint, fleeting. "You don't have to come here so often," she said suddenly, not meeting my eyes. I blinked, surprised. "Why not?" She hesitated. "Because people might misunderstand." Her words lingered, sharp yet uncertain. I could see the conflict flickering in her expression, not rejection, but fear. Fear of being seen, judged, whispered about. Maybe even fear of herself. "I don't care what people think," I said quietly. She finally looked at me, really looked, and her eyes held both affection and ache. "Maybe you don't," she murmured, "but I've lived long enough to know that sometimes it still matters." That was the first time she'd ever mentioned our age difference without naming it. The first time I felt the wall between us rise, invisible but solid. The following week, I didn't see her for 3 days. The cafe was run by someone else, a younger barista who said Elena was taking time off. I didn't ask questions. I just left, the air outside colder than it should have been. When she finally returned, I almost didn't recognize her. She looked beautiful, as always, but there was a fragility in her posture, like she'd been holding herself together too tightly. She smiled when she saw me, and for a moment, everything fell back into place. "You disappeared," I said. She exhaled softly. "Maybe I needed to see if I could." There was a pause, the kind that stretched just long enough to make the heart ache. "I missed your silence," I said finally. That made her laugh, a small, genuine sound that eased the tension in her shoulders. She glanced down, shaking her head. "You're too young to say things like that." "Maybe," I said, "but I mean them." Her hand froze mid-motion, then slowly set the cup down. Her gaze lifted to mine, careful, steady. There was again that mixture of longing and restraint, of wanting and refusing all at once. When I left that night, I turned back through the cafe window and caught her watching me go. Her reflection shimmered faintly against the glass. A woman torn between what she felt and what she believed she was allowed to feel. And I realized then that distance wasn't always measured in miles or years. Sometimes it was measured in fear. The next few evenings unfolded in quiet uncertainty. We'd crossed an invisible line, and though neither of us spoke of it, it hung in the air, fragile, persistent, like the aftertaste of something bittersweet. I started coming by after closing time, sometimes to help her stack chairs, sometimes just to sit while she cleaned up. She never asked me to leave, and I never asked to stay. It was an unspoken rhythm, one built on small gestures and glances that lingered a second too long. That night, the air outside was cool, heavy with the scent of approaching rain. Inside, the cafe glowed dimly under its amber lamps, shadows stretching soft across the floor. Elena was locking the front door while I gathered empty cups from the last table. "You don't have to help, you know," she said, voice quiet, back still turned. "I know," I replied, "but I want to—" When she turned to face me, there was something tender and uncertain in her eyes. She didn't thank me this time, just nodded, as though words would only make things harder. We finished in silence. The only sounds were the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of rain starting to fall outside. When I handed her the last cup, our fingers brushed, a small, familiar spark that neither of us dared to name. She froze for half a heartbeat before pulling back, setting the cup aside as if it had suddenly become too delicate to hold. "Would you like me to walk you home?" I asked, my voice softer than I meant it to be. She hesitated, weighing something invisible in her mind. Then, after a pause, she said, "If you don't mind the rain." We stepped out into the cool night, the street quiet except for the rhythmic tapping of raindrops on pavement. She didn't carry an umbrella, so I held mine between us. She moved closer, not enough to touch, but close enough that I could feel her warmth through the space between us. We walked slowly, our footsteps echoing softly in the narrow street. I could see the way the light from passing windows caught the edges of her hair, turning it gold against the darkness. When we reached her corner, she stopped. The rain was steady now, falling in thin silver lines. She looked at me with that same quiet restraint that had followed us for weeks. "Thank you," she said, "for tonight, and for not asking questions." I smiled. "I figured you'd tell me when you wanted to." She laughed lightly, almost to herself, then met my gaze. There was a silence, one that hummed with something unspoken, something neither of us could quite contain. "Elena," I said, barely a whisper. She looked up, and the way she said my name in return made the world go still. Her hand lifted slightly, as if she meant to touch my face, but she stopped just before. "I shouldn't," she murmured. "I know," I said, and yet neither of us stepped away. In that rain-soaked moment, no words, no promises, no clear direction. It felt as if everything we'd been holding back finally existed, suspended in the quiet between our breaths. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a beginning. It was simply feeling, finally finding a voice. The rain had returned that evening, soft, steady, and familiar, like the memory of a song that never really leaves. I arrived at the cafe just before closing. Through the window, I saw her sitting alone at one of the corner tables, the lights dimmed, her hands wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking from. She looked up when I entered. No smile this time, just that quiet acknowledgement that said, "You came back." "I thought you'd be home by now," she said, her voice calm but tired. "I couldn't sleep," I answered, hanging my jacket on the chair across from hers. "Figured coffee might help." She gave a faint laugh, the kind that holds more sadness than humor, and gestured toward the counter. "Help yourself. I'm off duty tonight." I poured us both a cup and sat opposite her. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was thick, charged waiting. Outside, the street lights blurred through the rain, painting the window in streaks of gold and gray. After a while, she said softly, Do you ever feel like something's happening inside you that you can't stop, even though you know you should? I looked at her, the way her fingers tightened slightly around the cup, the way her voice trembled just at the edges. All the time, I said. She sighed a long, trembling breath. I've been trying to make this go away, she confessed, eyes fixed on the steam rising between us. Whatever this is between us, I thought I could manage it, ignore it, pretend it's just kindness. But it's not. Her words hung there, fragile, almost afraid of being real. Elena, I began, but she shook her head, eyes glistening. Don't, she whispered. Let me say it before I lose the courage. The rain outside deepened, a steady rhythm against the glass. She stared at me, really stared. And for the first time, I saw the truth she'd been guarding for weeks. The tension, the restraint, the tenderness that had lived quietly in her gestures. It all surfaced at once. You have no idea, she said, voice trembling, how much I feel. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. The room seemed to shrink until it was just us, her words suspended in the air, my heart trying to make sense of them. She smiled then, a small, broken smile that carried both relief and fear. I don't even understand it myself, she went on. I'm older, cautious, supposed to know better. But every time I look at you, I feel alive. And it scares me. I reached across the table, slowly, deliberately. My fingers brushed hers, and she didn't pull away. Her hand was warm, trembling slightly, but steadying under my touch. I don't need you to explain it, I said quietly. I just want to be here, wherever that means. Her eyes softened, not with certainty, but surrender. She exhaled, her shoulders relaxing as though she'd been carrying that confession for years. For a long time, we said nothing, just sat there, hands intertwined, listening to the rain speak for us. And in that stillness, I understood love doesn't always begin with a kiss or a promise. Sometimes it begins with a sentence whispered through fear. You have no idea how much I feel. It's strange how quickly the heart adapts once it's been seen. After that night, the night she said those words, something between us softened. We didn't label it, didn't define it, but there was an understanding that no longer needed to hide behind silence. Days turned into weeks again. Only this time the rhythm felt natural. I still came to the café every morning, and she still pretended it was just coincidence, but her eyes always told a different story. When she handed me my cup now, her fingers lingered just a heartbeat longer. When I stayed late, she didn't rush to lock the door. It wasn't romance in a loud, movie kind of way. It was quieter, lived in, real. There was a Sunday morning I'll never forget. The city was waking slowly, sunlight filtering through the clouds after a long week of rain. She'd closed the cafe for the day, something she rarely did, and asked if I wanted to go for a walk. We wandered through the park near the river. The grass was still damp, and the air smelled faintly of jasmine. She wore a light beige coat, her hair loose for once, dancing a little with the breeze. There was no awkwardness, no need to fill the silence. Every so often, she'd glance at me, not shyly, not boldly, just knowingly. I've spent years building walls, she said softly as we stopped near the bridge. Not to keep people out, but to keep myself safe from feeling too much. I looked at her, the sunlight catching the faint lines near her eyes, the kind that told stories of laughter and loss. And now, I asked. She smiled faintly. Now I think I'm ready to feel again, even if it doesn't last forever. Something in me ached at that. I wanted to promise her forever, but I knew better. What we had wasn't about grand declarations. It was about being present in the small, sacred moments we'd been given. So instead, I just reached for her hand. She didn't hesitate. Her fingers slid into mine easily, naturally, like they'd always belonged there. We walked like that for a long time, two people who had stopped running from themselves. When she leaned her head lightly against my shoulder, I felt the quiet steadiness of her breathing, and the world around us seemed to slow. There were no fireworks, no dramatic kiss, no sweeping music, just sunlight and warmth, and the sound of the river moving beneath the bridge. Later, as we sat on a bench watching the day fade into gold, she turned to me and said, "Whatever this is, Thank you for not rushing it. I smiled. You taught me how not to. She laughed softly, her eyes reflecting the glow of the setting sun. I realized then that love doesn't always arrive to change your life. Sometimes it comes to steady it. As the sky deepened into evening, she rested her hand over mine, her thumb tracing small circles against my skin. And in that quiet moment, with nothing left to prove, nothing left to fear, I knew this was our forever. Not loud, not perfect, but real. A quiet kind of forever.